If you want to know about evolution, then the internet is probably the last thing you'd want to use. This talk addresses the problems that are encountered when trying to understand the evolution debate. Now, Richard Dawkins is one of those people you'll find quoted throughout the internet and has many passionate followers. So when he announces, "I am one of those scientists who feels that it is not enough just to get on and do science, we have to devote a significant portion of our time and resources to defending it from a deliberate attack from organised ignorance," he is being slightly disingenuous. He is actually attacking a small group, though proportionally large in a given location, such as in the religion belt of the southern states of America. He is attacking their views, but portraying them as the standard Christian view, but also attributing this particular niche view of young earth creationism to all spiritual thinkers and beliefs. He actually describes it as if there is a war raging, and that people who believe in evolution are under attack from people whose sole intent it is to destroy the truth and replace it with superstitious nonsense. This just simply isn't true. The problem is that seeing an opportunity to benefit from polarised rhetoric between opposing dogmas, the internet and media have latched onto his popularity and promote his view in contrast to a similarly myopic and opposing view of popularist young earth creationists. Better to entertain people rather than educate or inform them. So when Googling something to do with evolution, you don't find the latest studies, discoveries and theories. Instead, you are left with the impression that there is nothing left to find out about evolution. And if anyone dare question anything that Dawkins proclaims as fact, they are denounced as imbeciles, and who wants to be described as an imbecile? And this is the problem, that there is nothing wrong with questioning something, and doing so does not mean that evolution is being challenged. Rather, it is good scientific practice to test all scientific theories, which are falsifiable by nature. If something cannot be questioned, tested or examined or falsified, it is not science but dogma. It is this that this video is seeking to address. The actual problem is that it isn't evolution which is under attack, but rather a scientific debate about the process behind evolution. Now, what does that actually mean? If scientists and thinkers agree that evolution is true, but have yet to understand the nature of its process, then all that vocal bickering between both sides of extremes can achieve is to cloud the genuine biological and philosophical questions with emotive ideological worldviews. So instead of real debate and agreement, we are presented with neo-Darwinists on one hand, insisting that nobody questions their position, unless they want to be branded an idiot and banished, and on the other hand, the young earth creationists who similarly believe that they know the unquestionable truth, and that anyone who questions their authority will be cast out. There is no difference between these two extremes in practice, just that each believes themselves superior to the other. Now, this would be fine if it were just them, but when it impacts public opinion, and thus scientific funding, it is the genuine scientific questions about evolution that are prevented from being investigated and answered. So when Dawkins says that today the theory of evolution is about as much open to doubt as the theory that the Earth goes around the Sun, he is misdirecting observers away from the actual scientific inquiry, in an attempt to legitimise his dogma in its place. While it is true that evolution itself is not in question, his actual model for the mechanism is. So instead of stating his particular model for the underlying mechanism of evolution, Dawkins instead conflates the mechanism of the process of evolution with evolution itself, which is not in question. Thus, to question his model is portrayed as questioning the end result, that of evolution itself, thereby presenting a failing candidate for the mechanism as an unquestionable fact, and this is just not true. He plays on everyone's fear for our children's well-being when he states that our schools are under attack from irrational madmen and women, determined to replace science with mind control and religious brainwashing, no doubt tapping into fears of terrorist indoctrination. Now, being a Brit, I can't say that the far-right fundamental young earth creationists aren't trying to force their own dogma into schools. But this does not mean that his dogma is any better, just because it opposes it. In fact, presenting his preferred model of evolution without allowing students and teachers to employ good scientific inquiry, questioning hypotheses, comparing competing models to test robustness, and testing falsifiability, causes just as much damage to our children's ability to think and question as any dogmatic creationist alternative can. Surely we want our children to be the inquiring scientists of the future, and not just mindless sheep of one fundamentalist, rather than sheep of his opposite fundamentalist. In fact, these two quotes show the orchestrated dissonance that he is creating between the nature and the process of evolution, from the understanding of evolution itself. I cannot think of any useful purpose for him to do this, other than to misdirect and hamper progress in the field, for fear of losing status, since his particular model of choice is failing against the weight of modern discoveries. As scientists learn more about DNA coding and quantum biology, morphological biologists like Dawkins struggle to compete with other systems biologists, so as a last recourse he takes to the airwaves, bookshelves and internet in an attempt to conflate his model to the wider concept of evolution, so that any corrosion to his theory can be redefined as an attack on evolution itself from fundamentalist religions. This is simply not true, despite what it looks like on the internet or on our TV screens. So, if everyone accepts evolution, who is it that doesn't? Apart from some fringe extremists, and I'm not suggesting that these are limited in number, though compared to world population they may well be small in number, given that there are over 1.2 billion registered Catholics, who by the way have never opposed evolution, not counting other Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, agnostics, and other religious and spiritual groups. Rather, they appear larger in influence due to their localization, such as in southern parts of the US, where they outnumber localized non-creationists. And this isn't just true of the fundamental Christians. The neo-atheists such as Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett and Harris and their followers are equally small in number compared to the larger cohort of atheists and agnostics, who are in turn far fewer than religious believers. Yet they still remain sizable, and added to their dominance on the internet and media, present a false image of consensus, both on the religious side and the atheist side. So it is in their interest to try to convince everyone that everything is black and white, and that there can only be two opinions. Either you believe evolution, and therefore their particular model for it, or you don't, in which case you are a crackpot. And similarly from the opposite group, God is obvious, and to not believe in everything that he says, as described through their mouths, then you are blaspheming and ignorant. And if you have to choose between the two, then suddenly all inquiry stops, and you're forced to choose between one dogma or the other. The truth is that everyone accepts the concept of evolution to one degree or another. Just stop and ask any person on the street, even those people who hold religious beliefs. For example, the Catholics, as I've already mentioned, have always believed in evolution. They just differ in the nature of the mechanism of evolution. Thus, before we can begin to understand evolution, or even piece together all the information that we are finding, we must first remove the distractions of false ideological black and white dichotomies from vocal extremist groups parading as a consensus for their tribe, so as to reveal the facts, truths, and information which they have obscured for fear of losing their dominance with their own particular worldviews and money-making enterprises. So when Dawkins states that evolution is as much open to doubt as the theory that Earth revolves around the sun, he is stating the obvious. The question is, why does he feel the need to state it? Well, human beings are social animals, and as such gather together in groups for safety and security. And as such, each group will then proceed to defend itself against any perceived threats, even at the cost of their community's lives. And should anyone not in the group approach with different ideas, beliefs, or even just appearance, then the group will entrench to repel the outsider and polarize everything from outside the group as being the antithesis of everything they hold to be true, creating an us and them dichotomy, to remove any and all grey areas so that only stark parody remains. Just look at the schoolyard social group dynamics to see it in action on a smaller scale. And this is because that as a species, we all prefer to belong to a group, and not just any group, but to a successful group. Simple social biology. And as such, we avoid complexity and grey areas when we perceive ourselves backed into a corner, and so prefer black and white structures, right and wrong ethics, with us or against us mentalities. Now when a group feels threatened, whether they are actually threatened or not, they perceive everything about the outsiders as being the antithesis of what they cherish, no matter how absurd. So invader armies eat children and sacrifice virgins, etc. So any topic or belief of an outsider is defined by being the opposite of the group's topic or belief, rather than the actual differences, whether outsiders hold these views or not. So when, in the case of evolution, which one group accepts, is addressed, members of the group are incapable of hearing any outside consideration, and instead attributes nonsense to everything said, rather than trying to understand the objections. And they often adopt superiority based on their fallacious view of all outsiders. Hence Dawkins' claim that science is under attack from ignorance. Us and them, black and white, nothing to question. Of course, in the case of evolution, there is no attack. Rather, there is bickering between extremist factions who hold different interpretations of the mechanism behind evolution, based on their dogmatic worldviews. But if everybody already accepts evolution, then how come we've ended up in a situation where actual scientific study is under attack from both extremists, with everyone readily accepting an us and them mentality, with persistent arguments ranging all over YouTube, Wikipedia, and internet search engines like Google? I would suggest that this is sheer tribalism, and that everyone accepts the concept of evolution and even its mechanism, that of natural selection, but that it is the nature of the mechanism that is as yet unknown. And it is this nature of the mechanism that needs to be investigated, unhindered by claims of fact against fiction, science against ignorance, since we are finding more and more anomalies that appear to contradict the established models. So the question is not about evolution as a concept, despite how the extremists like to project it, but actually what fundamentally lies behind it, what drives it along. And this is where we find the actual evolution debate. And it generally can be grouped as three competing scientific camps. But unlike the extremist camps with an us and them mentality, these groups have plenty of overlap and agreement, and the scientists work together despite holding different paradigms which they are testing. So when Dawkins says that science and ignorance are at war, it is not true. This is because these conflicting groups of scientists all believe in evolution and the process itself, but they differ in the nature of the process. So while one group believes evolution is unguided, another believes it is guided by some process. And of those who believe that it is guided, there is the group that attributes this process as an effect with a cause, usually referred to as God. So what about the first group, whom I refer to as the blind chance tribe? Well, this group believes that the process behind evolution is driven by blind chance, and that all life we see around us has evolved purely by accident through nothing more than Darwin's theory of natural selection on random mutations. But as we look deeper into nature, we can see elements of design, repeating motifs such as fractal and Golden selection, which suggests that everything looks like it is actually designed and not accidental. Now this tribe accepts this observation but suggests that it's purely coincidental, and that just because it appears as if it were designed, that doesn't mean that it was designed. The illusion of design, they say, can arrive accidentally, since only mutations with better design are selected by natural selection and preserved. Now it is within this particular cohort of scientists where we find one half of the extremists. They promote an image which is not strictly true, since the scientists in this cohort are actually working on trying to understand just how the observed appearance of design can be reduced through chance. Not an easy task given the evidence of intrinsic information at the very basis of nature. These scientists tend to comprise of materialists and physicalists, morphological evolutionists, as well as neo-Darwinists. The problem is that the vocal neo-Darwinists who are saying, do not question this tribe, and we represent the whole of the tribe, and thus we represent the entirety of evolutionary theory. This is where the extremist faction is being disingenuous. The second and largest group, whom I refer to here as the guided process tribe, actually believes that evolution is happening and that there is observable design, but that it's actually guided by an unknown underlying structure. However, they don't say that this is necessarily a conscious being who has designed something and put it into place, but they say that evolution shows that it isn't undirected and that there is some sense of direction. Currently, they believe this to be fundamental information that could lay at the heart of the entire cosmos, or even reality itself. Some go further to suggest that it is mathematical in structure, and that this fundamental information is akin to computer systems, simple binary or digital information. This by far is the most prominent view among scientists of all worldviews. Yet if you look at the internet and YouTube, you'll be forgiven for being totally unaware that this is so, because even though it's large and popular, it's pretty much obscured by the loud extremists from both tribes 1 and 3, as they continually battle, thus drowning out all other voices. Now this view is actually held by genetic system evolutionists of various worldviews, both quantum and classical scientists, and philosophers and Eastern religions, which, despite all the internet clamour to the contrary, are not those spiritual or theistic positions which neo-Darwinists attack. Despite appearances, these attacks actually target the relatively small, concentrated in location, group of opposing extremists, typically non-representative Abrahamic religions. Yet it is presenting both extremist, polarised minority opinions as representing the current scientific consensus, both theistic and atheistic, and it is a false dichotomy. Similar to Tribe 2, the Watchmaker, Tribe 3, accept that the appearance of design in nature is evidence of an underlying structure, and that it is mathematical in nature, but they go one step further in suggesting that this structure is evidence of a director, some metaphysical mind, will or consciousness, and that the attributes of this unseen director correlate with various religious depictions of creator gods. This should not be conflated with the non-representative extremist faction of young earth creationists, against whom Dawkins is actually attacking under the guise of anti-scientists, who go beyond scientific inquiry and state that this director is a god who created the cosmos and seeded it with a false history and false fossil evidence. Admittedly, this faction would still fall under the umbrella of the Watchmaker, just as the opposite extremist faction falls under the blind chance umbrella. But just as with their counterparts, they do not represent the majority of the cohort, which consists of monist philosophers, theist philosophers, and monotheistic religions, but instead successfully drown out their voices. Now what this tribe actually holds true is that there is a cause behind the apparent direction, and that this describes their own director, or particular monotheistic god, but the fact that the majority of scientists in this tribe hold a religious worldview should not invalidate their scientific theories, just as the worldviews of scientists in the other tribes should not invalidate their own scientific theories. But the fact that factions at both extremes of the spectrum use evolution investigation to further their own opposing worldviews distracts future scientific inquiries from the real questions towards a non-related philosophical, non-scientific debate between young earth creationists and their equally damaging neo-Darwinists. So what does this all mean? We find that there are 3 tribes who all accept evolution, that they are differentiated in what they theorise is the nature of the process behind evolution, and that they all continue to question and test their theories in light of an ever-increasing supply of evidence. So there is no war between scientists and organised ignorance, as Dawkins and the media proclaim. It's actually an investigation as to how evolution comes to be, while noisy extremists with a worldly agenda dominate the publicity machine. In conclusion, what can we do about it? The only way that actually is possible is not engage with a false war between scientists and delusional religious people, despite how it might appear on YouTube and Wikipedia, etc. It's actually a war between extremists with an us and them mentality who only want to make the question about themselves. They have no interest in investigating the difficult questions surrounding evolution, but instead seek to convert people into accepting their worldviews without question, to accept dogma which states either God did it and do not question, or God didn't do it and still do not question, with both sides claiming intellectual authority and condemning those who disagree, or even simply ask questions. We instead need to continually dig deeper objectively until we understand what lies at the foundation of evolution, how it came to be, why we're here, do we have purpose, and if so, what purpose? So, putting aside the actual questions about evolution and the worldview fanatics who hijack the debate constantly, where exactly does science currently stand on evolutionary theory? Well, there is still a long way to go, with many questions remaining unanswered. But as we uncover more and more about the role of DNA and cellular molecular biology, the more the old Darwinian model falls apart. But this doesn't mean that Darwin's ideas are jettisoned, or that any new model adapts, modifies and corrects those inherent inaccuracies. And this is not a seismic event, as the theory has been evolving since first published to integrate cellular biology, DNA, genetics, epigenetics, group, individual natural selection, quantum biology, etc., as evidenced by the old theory of evolution, long since being replaced by the theory of new synthesis. To suggest that it isn't evolving, that it is a hard fact, just as the Earth revolves around the Sun, is disingenuous, and to mislead others as to the current model and its implications, and portray the work as a war between science and disorganised ignorance, is offensive to the hard, genuine scientific inquiry. This does not mean that there isn't a war between these two extreme positions, as there is, and it is ubiquitous, but that neither faction can claim authority to ridicule the other in the name of science. Nobody is helped by people with fundamentalist worldviews and agenda, trying to stifle the debates by protesting that there is nothing else to learn, that we know it all already, everyone should just shut up and give us status and money. We must put aside differing worldviews and acknowledge that there are questions, and actually seek to understand them in light of held worldviews, not the other way around. And should it turn out that evidence contradicts any previously held convictions, then we should be prepared to adapt or change the convictions, whatever they may have been, as appropriate. To ignore questions and answers and use a chosen worldview as the a priori basis is not scientific, despite how much Dawkins et al. Proclaim that it is. So should a scientist be Christian who believes God created Adam and Eve, just as it says in the Bible, this doesn't necessarily stop him investigating the evidence, hoping that his or her worldview is vindicated. No more so than some scientist with an opposing worldview looking at the same evidence, hoping to show that Adam and Eve didn't happen, and thus that God doesn't exist. These two investigations, even though working from opposite ends of the spectrum, should be able to unearth better understanding regardless of motive, as long as they use science. So yes, everyone has worldviews which are going to influence motives, but the scientific method is just that, a method. It is a model used to investigate things objectively, and worldview should not take centre stage. To argue that the questions of evolution are clear-cut between differing ideological worldview is simply not true.